Once upon a time, there was a young man, 17 years old, who was the second youngest of 12 brothers. He was the favorite of the 12 by his father, and his brothers who were older than him, those 10 brothers, hated him so much that they eventually sold him into slavery. He was taken to Egypt, served a man whose name was Potiphar, who was the captain of the guard, that is, the captain of the secret service and the head executioner and the head prison master. He was unfairly accused by Potiphar's wife, and he was then thrown in prison. In prison, this young man, who was growing and getting older, rose to the highest position among the prisoners, and in that position he had an opportunity to help two of Pharaoh's most powerful men. Pharaoh, that is, the king of Egypt. Egypt, that is, the most powerful empire on earth at that time. Two of Pharaoh's most powerful leaders had been thrown in prison for a time while he investigated accusations of wrongdoing against them. And while they were in prison, Joseph, who was the most powerful man in that prison, was able to help them by interpreting dreams. 2 years after the dream interpretation, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world, Pharaoh had 2 dreams. One of those men in prison whom Joseph had assisted remembered him. They called him to Pharaoh. He interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, dreams which would prophesy or predict 7 years of plenty in the growing and the grain, followed by 7 years of famine. The first 7 years, Joseph told Pharaoh, based on his dreams, they were to save up. They were to take extra and put it aside so that in the 7 years of famine, they would have enough food. In turn, Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of that. Joseph would become the most powerful man in Egypt other than Pharaoh. As Joseph oversaw the 7 years of plenty, he built storage areas. He had locations out from the capital of Egypt all through the land where he kept the excess, the savings, if you will. This was a savings account for Egypt. Then the 7 years of famine began. And after 2 years of famine, Joseph, who was in charge of distributing the grain for people who came. People were coming from all over the land to get grain because Egypt had it. And after 2 years, guess who shows up to buy grain? Those brothers who had sold Joseph into slavery. 10 of his brothers, minus Benjamin, who stayed at home with his father Jacob. When the brothers showed up, it had been about 20 to 25 years, give or take, since they had seen Joseph and since he had seen them. Last time they had seen Joseph, he was about 17, 18, 19 years old. You do the math. Now he's early to mid-40s. When the brothers showed up, Joseph recognized them. They did not recognize him. They were in a group of 10, and I would say they were a little older than Joseph, and so the difference in you from 25 or 28 to 40 is not as drastic as the difference in you from 17 to 40. Amen. And so that led to the fact that the brothers didn't recognize Joseph, but he recognized them. Also led to the fact that they were in a group of 10, and Joseph saw them as a group, and they were brothers. Not only that, but for 20 years, Joseph had been in Egypt, and for much of those, he had been a leader and a ruler. We'll find here in a moment, he had learned the Egyptian language. He was wearing the Egyptian clothes. I'm sure he was an older man now and completely different. Besides that, these brothers, I suspect, were convinced that Joseph was dead by now. The scene that takes place over 4 chapters. Now, this is intriguing. An event that probably could have been written about in 1 chapter in Genesis covers 4 chapters. And I shared with Pastor Mike and Pastor Brian earlier this week. I was doing my dead level best to try to break this up into pieces, but I'm just not sure how you break this entire event and story into several pieces. And so here it is, one sermon, and we're going to be covering 4 chapters today. It begins with the brothers in Egypt to buy grain, and Joseph is there. Listen to this. If you want a main idea for today's message, listen to this. God, in His sovereign will, often works in amazing and puzzling ways, but He always has a plan that glorifies Him and edifies His people. God, in His sovereign will often work in puzzling ways, but He always has a plan that glorifies Him and edifies you. Folks, there are some puzzling turns to God's sovereignty. Let's look at a few of those today. We have a lot to cover, so let's just jump right in Genesis chapter 42. When Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" Probably a bit of sarcasm included and intended. And he said, "Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die." Remember, Jacob now has 11 sons. Joseph is gone. All their families, grandchildren, wives. He has a fairly large contingent of people. So when you're talking about Jacob's family, he has essentially a small city under his oversight. Verse 3, so Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers. Point of clarification. Joseph and Benjamin had the same mother, who was Rachel. They were the only 2 brothers who had the same mother and father. Or at least Benjamin was Joseph's only brother who had the same mother and father. So Joseph and Benjamin were full brothers. I note here that Jacob will not allow Benjamin to go with his 10 older brothers. Do you remember the last time one of Rachel's sons spent time with his 10 older brothers? They sold him into slavery. Now, Jacob didn't know that, but Jacob knew he wasn't about to send Benjamin with them. Verse 5. And the sons of Israel went to buy grain among those who journeyed, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. Very intriguing turn of events. I've got to tell you, as powerful as Joseph was, I find it hard to believe that he personally administrated the grain offerings at every place. There's no way he could have done that. It would be like the governor of a state personally writing out tax bills to send out, personally handling the interstate system, personally writing out speeding tickets. He couldn't do that. He oversees all that, and so was Joseph. But for some reason, Joseph happened to be here personally administrating the giving out of grain to these brothers. And now it had been 20 or 25 years since they had seen him. They put him in a well and then sold him into slavery the last time, and now they're bowing down before him. But they don't know that. Verse 7, Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. Then he said to them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." So Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Then Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about them and said to them, "You are spies." Remember the dream that Joseph had dreamed? He dreamed that the dreams he had told him that his brothers would bow down before him and that even his parents would bow down before him, if you recall those dreams. And they laughed at him and they criticized him. And maybe Joseph could have done a little bit better on his presentation of the dreams at the time, but the fact is, the dreams are now coming true. Verse 10. And they said to him, "No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all one man's sons. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." Let me ask you a question. How long do you think is enough time for God to bring about justice in the wrongdoing in your life? Whoever it was who wronged you, whatever the situation, whatever the company was that wronged you in your job, whatever the employer was that wronged you in your position, whoever the family member was who wronged you years ago, how long do you think is long enough where God will ultimately bring about justice? I mean, what kind of time frame do you think should happen? What is reasonable? All I know is this: God's bringing about justice here, and it took some 20 or 25 years, and I'm just wondering how many of us are prepared to trust God that long. Could I suggest to you that in the sovereignty of God, one of the puzzling turns of God's sovereignty is bringing His justice in time? I believe there are situations and experiences repeatedly where we have trouble accepting the fact that justice hasn't been brought to this situation. It's been 2 months, it's been 6 months, it's been 2 years, and I'm asking you, how many of us are prepared to trust God for 25 years or 20 years knowing that justice hasn't been brought about before it finally comes? How many of us will trust Him that time? Folks, there are Christians right now not in church because they're mad at God because of something that happened to them. A trial, a health issue, a situation. Someone wronged them, someone spoke badly of them, and they don't believe justice has been carried out. But could I suggest to you one of the puzzling turns of God's sovereignty? That is turn one as we look today, is bringing His justice in time. Bringing His justice in time. Look at chapter 42. Look at verse 25. We're skipping ahead, not to skip Scripture, but let me just give you a little bit of a summary on what happens between verse 12 and verse 25. Joseph continues to question his brothers harshly. Some of you may ask, well, if Joseph loves God and Joseph's after God, why is he questioning his brothers harshly? I believe it's a very practical step, and I've wondered about this for a while, to be honest with you. I believe it's somewhat of a practical step. You remember the last time Joseph saw his brothers, they threw him in a well and then sold him into slavery. I believe he's testing to see if they are the same people that he knew 20 or 25 years ago. And I would suggest to you that if they were the same guys, I'm not so sure this would have turned out the same. I believe he's testing them. He accuses them of spying, and then he puts them in prison for 3 days. And it's interesting to note their conversation in the prison. They actually get put in prison, and immediately they say, "We should never have thrown our brother Joseph. We should never have sold our brother Joseph into slavery. Now we're being punished." Could it be that for 20 or 25 years, every time something bad happened to these brothers, they went back to, "Oh, wow, we're being punished. We never should have sold Joseph into slavery"? Could it be that after they did what they did, as horrible as it was selling off Joseph, they lived with this regret, they lived with this guilt, they lived with this sin for decades? So that's what happens in prison, and then we pick up in verse 25. Then Joseph gave a command to fill their sacks with grain, to restore every man's money to his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. Thus he did for them. They're now out of jail. Joseph is sending them back home. So they loaded their donkeys with the grain and departed from there. By the way, at this point, Joseph has continued to test them. Not only that, but they had to leave one of their brothers behind. Verse 27, so as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey feed at the encampment, he saw his money, and there it was in the mouth of his sack. Joseph had instructed one of his rulers to return the money into their sacks. It's interesting, as he's testing them, he also has this love for his brothers. Folks, 20 or 25 years, and you think justice hadn't been brought. Are you going to be able to trust God during that time? Joseph did. These are the men who had ruined his life. Well, at the time, he thought they had ruined his life. Now, he's the most powerful man in Egypt. And rather than looking at it as his opportunity to get retribution against them, to get justice against them, he sees an opportunity to begin to reestablish his relationship with them, and that'll happen. Watch this. Verse 28, so he said to his brothers, my money has been restored, and there it is in my sack. Then their hearts failed them, and they were afraid, saying to one another, what is this that God has done to us? Again, for 20 or 25 years, every time something bad happens, they go back to, God's punishing us. God's punishing us. Listen, you think God's not brought, it's been a year, 2 years, 5 years, and you think God's not brought about justice. God was bringing about justice in their lives for 20 years. They lived with the horror of what they had done. Verse 29, then they went to Jacob, their father, in the land of Canaan and told him all that had happened to them, saying, the man who is Lord of the land spoke roughly to us, took us for spies in the country. But he said to them, but we said to him, we are honest men, we are not spies, we are 12 brothers, sons of our father, one who is no more, and the youngest is with our father this day in the land of Canaan. Then the man, the Lord of the country, said to us, by this I will know you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers, they left Simeon behind, here with me, take food for the famine of your households, and be gone. And bring your youngest brother to me, so I shall know that you are not spies, but that you are honest men. I will grant your brother to you, and you may trade in the land. Then it happened, as they emptied their sacks, that surprisingly, each man's bundle of money was in a sack. And when they and their father saw the bundles of money, they were afraid. They were afraid it would appear that they've stolen the money or stolen the grain and gotten their money back. And Jacob, their father, said to them, you have bereaved me. and Jacob says something intriguing here. He says, you have bereaved me. Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more. And you want to take Benjamin? Joseph told them, don't come back unless you got your youngest brother. I want to know that you're not spies. All these things are against me. It's intriguing to me that in this list of things that had happened to him, that his sons had done, he mentions Joseph being no more. I suspect Jacob knew in his heart of hearts something had happened to Joseph that had to do with his brothers. All these years, all these decades. I've told you this, nothing quite that breaks our heart probably anymore as a parent than to know our siblings can't stand each other, or to know that one set of siblings came out against another and now they're at war. And so Jacob dealt with this for decades. Verse 36, and Jacob their father said to them, you have bereaved me. Joseph's no more, Simeon is no more. You want to take Benjamin? All these things are against me. Then Reuben spoke to his father, saying, kill my 2 sons. If I do not bring him back to you, put him in my hands, and I will bring him back to you. But he said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is left alone. If any calamity should befall him along the way in which you go, then you will bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. Simeon stayed in Egypt. Jacob says, you're not taking Benjamin back down there. So meanwhile, they just kind of wait. They've got enough grain to take care of them for a while in Jacob's camp. Here's the intriguing part. Number one, they're going to have to go back to Egypt to get more food eventually. Number two, they're going to have to go back to Egypt to get Simeon back. It's as if God's saying, I want to make sure that I sovereignly set up a way that Jacob's people, Israel, have to go down to Egypt. I'm not going to leave any option. And it brings me to my second turn of God's puzzling sovereignty, and it is that He bends our crisis into truth. Part of the prophecy of the Old Testament is that God's people would go down to Egypt and would tarry there for a while. Now, we know that ultimately to be 400 years. But God is working out plans and details ultimately to force Jacob and his family to go back to Egypt. They had to go back to Egypt to get food, and they had to go back to Egypt to get Simeon. I don't know what your crisis is, but could I suggest to you that part of that crisis is God bending it to His truth? God using your crisis to bend your destiny, your future into His truth. It looks like crisis now, but it will be translated ultimately into God's truth. You need to trust Him. Chapter 43. Now the famine was severe in the land, and it came to pass when they had eaten up the grain which they had brought from Egypt, that their father said to them, Go back, buy us a little food. But Judah spoke to him, saying, The man solemnly warned us, saying, You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. If you send your brother with us, we will go down and buy you food. Dad, you're going to have to send Benjamin, or we're not going down. But if you will not send him, we will not go down. For the man said to us, You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. And I love this answer from Jacob. He says in verse 6, Why did you deal so wrongfully with me as to tell the man whether or not you had another brother? And Judah's like, Dad, we're just answering questions. How do we know? Here's some stranger asking us about our family. Ask us if we had a dad. Ask us if we had a younger brother. We're just answering the questions, trying not to get killed. How would we know when he found out we had a younger brother, he'd want us to bring him back to him? It's a funny situation. Jacob is convinced that his sons have cursed him. In verse 8, Then Judah said to Israel his father, Send the lad with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you, and also our little ones. I myself will be surety for him. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever, which is intriguing because Judah would be the lineage that would produce the Messiah, Jesus Christ. I got to tell you, folks, some of this stuff that's happening among the patriarchs, it's like the lineage of Christ was hanging on by a thread. It's like the lineage of Christ was just barely hanging in there. Isaac, as his father held the knife over him to sacrifice him. Judah offering to go down to Egypt. I mean, on and on we can go where we find times where it's almost like the lineage of Christ didn't make it. But the sovereignty of God. Verse 11, their father Israel said to them, If it must be so, then do it. He tells them to go on down, take double the money. Take the money you brought back with you last time and take more money to pay. At least offer to return the money to them that ended up in your sacks before, and go on down. Look at what's happening. In fact, Jacob even says, You know what? Here's the deal. I'm going to send you down, and if my children don't make it, then I guess they just don't. I've just got to turn this thing over to the Lord. God's sovereignty is puzzling, folks. We have an idea about exactly how God's to work from point A to point B to point C. And I got to tell you, sometimes it goes from A to T to Q to C, then to Z. It doesn't always look the same, but I'll tell you this, God's sovereignty works in this way. Puzzling turn number 3. Bearing His events toward His cause. Now, not only do the sons have to return, they're bringing Benjamin back down to Egypt. God has a cause. He's going to get His folks down to Egypt. Not only, well, look at this. If Jacob's people stayed in Canaan, There's a good chance they all die of starvation anyway during the famine years. But if he gets them down to Egypt, they will be taken care of, where they will multiply for years and years. And yes, ultimately they will be taken into slavery, but all that 400 years while they're down in Egypt, they're multiplying and becoming a great nation. How do you get the family to decide to go down and live in Egypt? I mean, you're not going to go up to Jacob and say, hey, Jacob, I've got some riverfront property on the Mediterranean Sea in Egypt for you that I can sell you at a real cheap price. He's not going to buy it. He's not leaving Canaan. That's his home. That's where his family's raised. How are you going to get him to leave? God has a plan. How's God going to get you to step out? How's God going to get you to step out into some area where you just didn't think you could, or maybe you never would? He might bring about some crisis in your life to take his events and bear his events toward his cause in your life. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, Pastor Johnny, when I got laid off from that job, I went ahead and moved into an area that I'd always wanted to try, but I never would have because I had a good job and insurance and benefits and all that. But when I got laid off, I tried it, and boy, it came successful. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to have been in business, how many people in ministry. So they really believed the Lord was leading them, but they had a good job. And finally, something happened that forced them out, and they had really no other choice but to go on God's route. Sometimes God is taking your situation and your events and bearing them toward his cause. Chapter 43, verse 16. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, take these men to my home and slaughter an animal and make ready, for these men will dine with me at noon. This is kind of it's part humorous, part intriguing. Joseph brings them into his house, serves them a meal. Initially, they think he's bringing them in to punish them for taking his money. Remember last trip down, they showed back up at home with the money that they had brought to pay for the grain in their sacks. Well, now they think Joseph, or they still don't know it's Joseph, by the way. The 10 brothers plus Benjamin, they think he's inviting them in to eat a meal in their house to punish them. They sit down, and here's the intriguing part. They first tell one of the directors under Joseph, one of the building masters. They begin to tell him, hey, when we got home last time, we found that the money that we brought to pay for the grain last time was still in our bags. We brought that money back. Here, we don't want it. And the building master tells them, you know what? God must have provided that for you. I remember receiving your money, which he did. He had received their money the time before. He tells them, hey guys, don't worry about it. God must have just blessed you with that money. All the while, the brothers are speaking in Hebrew, assuming that no one understood them. Joseph had been all the while speaking in the Egyptian language through an interpreter. Other than that interpreter, guess who was the only other person who could understand what the brothers were saying? Joseph. So they come in to sit down around the table. Some intriguing stuff happens. Look at verse 29. Then he lifted his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, is this your younger brother of whom you spoke to me? And he said, God be gracious to you, my son. Now his heart yearned for his brother, so Joseph made haste and sought somewhere to weep. His heart is going out to his brothers. Now he realizes they've changed. They've changed. Here's my younger brother. All this that's happened through these years, it's like Joseph's getting it now. Verse 31. And then he washed his face and came out, and he restrained himself and said, serve the bread. So they set him a place by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat food with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. And interestingly enough, their master was a Hebrew, Joseph. They wouldn't eat with the Hebrews, but their leader, Joseph, was a Hebrew. And notice what happened in verse 33. This is blowing the brothers' minds. And they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth, and the men looked in astonishment at one another. They all sit down. Hey, you sit here. Reuben, you sit here. Simeon, Judah, you sit here. You got Levi here. Benjamin here. And they all sat down, and they started looking around at one another and going, wait just a second. They put us in the perfect order of our birth. How would they know? How would these Egyptians know what order we were born in? Verse 34, then he took servings to them from before him, but Benjamin's serving was 5 times as much as any of the others. Just wanted you to know, guys, this is my baby brother. I love y'all, but I really love Benjamin. So they drank and were merry with him. Some of the turns we've just looked at in God's sovereignty. The way he brings about his justice over time, the way he bends his crisis into truth, the way he bears his events in our life toward his cause. He's taking our events and moving them toward his cause. But watch this. These things are happening among the brothers in ways they never could have imagined. Putting them in order of birth, Joseph being over them, they still didn't know it was Joseph yet. All this stuff had happened in their lives as a matter of course. And could I suggest to you that one of the radical turns of God's sovereignty is when he blends his designs into our lives and we don't even know it. Joseph's brothers had no idea what was going on after they sold Joseph into slavery. They had lived for years with regret, but what was happening on the backside of what they knew, Joseph was raising to power. Joseph was developing an oversight, and eventually it would save their family, and all of this was being built into the design of God's fabric. God's quilting a quilt out of your life, so to speak. And he's designing things in your life that you're not even aware of. I got to tell you, one of the funnest things for me is for God to allow something to happen in my life that opens my eyes to the fact that over the course of years, he's done something in my heart that I didn't even realize he had done. Maybe 10 years ago, there was an event that happened in my life, and I would respond a certain way that I knew wasn't pleasing to God. And 10 years later, God allows the same type of event to happen in my life, and I respond very differently. And I can't tell you how many times this has happened to me where I stepped away from that event and went, wow. It is obvious to me I responded differently now to this event than I did the same type of event 10 years ago, and I didn't even realize God had been growing me. He kind of did it behind my back, you know. And God is blending his designs into our lives. It's like the story of Ruth Wakefield. Sound familiar to anybody? It will in just a minute. In fact, she might be one of your favorite people by the time I finish this story. She was born in 1905. She grew up to be a dietitian and a food lecturer. She graduated from the Framingham State Normal School Department of Household Arts in 1924. Her husband, Kenneth, and her bought a tourist lodge. You want to know the name of it? This is true. The Toll House Inn. She prepared all the recipes for all the meals served to her guests. In 1930, Ruth Wakefield was mixing a batch of cookies for her guests. She discovered she was trying to make chocolate cookies, but she had run out of baker's chocolate. Guess what she put in place instead of baker's chocolate? She substituted some semi-sweet chocolate chips. She thought that as it baked, the chips would melt and they would become chocolate cookies. What happened? They didn't melt. That's what I'm saying. No lie. When she removed the pan from the oven, by the way, I found this article on inventors.com, ironically enough. When she removed the pan from the oven, she realized that she had invented chocolate chip cookies. She called her creation the Toll House Crunch Cookies. They became very popular locally. And the recipe was soon published in a Boston newspaper. As the popularity of the Toll House Crunch Cookie increased, the sales of Nestle's semi-sweet chocolate bars also spiked. They probably hadn't sold many of those. And as the chocolate chip cookies increased, so did the sale of their candy bars that you broke into pieces and made those the chocolate chips. So here's what they did, and they still do. Andrew Nestle and Ruth Wakefield came up with an agreement. Nestle would print the Toll House cookie recipe on his package, and Wakefield would be given a lifetime supply of Nestle's chocolate. Now, I got to tell you, if that happened today, she would have a lawyer, and she would get some money out of the deal. But I'm just saying back then, you never know what God's doing in our lives. Sometimes something pops up we never anticipated. These guys are sitting before Joseph, eating in front of him, have no idea what's going on, have no idea what God's been doing for the last couple of decades. Could I suggest you have no idea what God's designing in your life right now? But Pastor Johnny, what do I do then if I don't know? That's the point. You trust God day by day by day. The sovereignty of God is one of the most comforting doctrines in the Bible. I can trust God. He's weaving something in my life. Look at chapter 44. And he commanded the steward of his house, this is kind of the end of the meal, saying, fill the men's sacks with food as much as they can carry, and put each man's money in the mouth of his sack. He's putting the money back again. It's great. He's messing with these guys bad. Also put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest, and his grain money. So he did according to the word that Joseph had spoken. And so as soon as the morning dawned, the men were sent away, they and their donkeys. And so what happens, Joseph sends one of his guards after them and says, find the cup, and when you find the cup, let them know that they've robbed me. Of course, Joseph had the cup stuck in there. He had it stuck in Benjamin's sack. And they come across the brothers, and the brothers say, none of us stole the silver cup. Are you kidding me? And they go as far as to say, I'll tell you what, whoever has that cup in his bag, and they say this to Joseph's guard, whoever has that cup in his bag, he'll die and we'll all become your slaves. Well, that's a little over the top. And the guard says, no, I don't need all that. Here's all I'm going to do. If I find that cup, whoever's bag I find that cup with, I'm taking him back to Egypt with me to become my master's servant. Of course, he finds it in Benjamin's bag. And the guys are falling apart. Oh, law, what are we going to do now? They go back to Egypt. They're not going to go home and tell Jacob, I ain't going home. Verse 18. Then Judah came near to him and said, oh, my Lord, please let your servant speak a word in my Lord's hearing, and do not let your anger burn against your servant, for you are even like Pharaoh. He's speaking to Joseph now, still doesn't know it's Joseph. My Lord asked his servant, saying, have you a father or brother? And we said to my Lord, we have a father, an old man, and a child of his old age, who is young, and his brother is dead, and he is alone left of his mother's children. And his father loves him, speaking of Benjamin. Then you said to your servants, bring him down to me, that I may set my eyes on him. And we said to my Lord, the lad cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. But you said to your servants, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you shall see my face no more. Translation, you get no food. So it was, when we went up to your servant, my father, that we told him the words of my Lord. And our father said, go back and buy us a little food. But we said, we cannot go down if our youngest brother is not with us. But if he's with us, we will go down, for we may not see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Then your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons, and the one went out from me, and I said, surely he is torn to pieces. This is Jacob, what he had said now, and I have not seen him since. And Jacob said, but if you take this one also from me, and calamity befalls him, you shall bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. Now therefore, when I come to your servant my father, and the lad is not with us, Judah saying, now, if I go back and tell daddy, oh law. When I come to your servant my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, it will happen, verse 31, when he sees that the lad is not with us, that he will die. So your servants will bring down the gray hair of your servant, our father, with sorrow to the grave. For your servant became surety for the lad to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father forever. He's saying, I told him it would be my fault if I don't bring Benjamin back. I'm taking the blame. Remember the last time one of Rachel's sons came up missing? Who took the blame? Let's think back. Let's think back. Who took the blame? A wild animal took the blame, right? Remember when they sold Joseph off and they came back to Jacob and they had killed an animal and put the blood on Joseph's coat of many colors and brought it back to Jacob and said, a wild animal killed him. Wink, wink. Something's happened in the life of these men. They're different. In verse 33, now therefore please let your servant remain instead of the lad as a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. Look, Benjamin is still Jacob's favorite. But for some reason, they don't hate Benjamin like they had hated Joseph. Could it be that something had changed? Yeah, they had changed. And Joseph, before his very eyes, is seeing a group of guys that the last time he saw him hated him because he was the favorite brother and sold him into slavery. And yet now they've got a favorite brother, Benjamin, and they are protecting him with their lives. Now, I'm not saying they're perfect, but they certainly are changed, aren't they? For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest perhaps I see the evil that would come upon my father? They sure weren't worried about the evil that would come upon their father when they went and told him Joseph was gone. Turn number 5 in God's puzzling sovereignty is He baffles our plans with His will. Baffling our plans with His will. Look, these men, Joseph's brothers, they were completely confused. And could I suggest to you that sometimes God takes our plans, and certainly we should plan. I believe we should plan. I believe we should set goals. I believe we should seek to reach those goals. But we should always do that knowing all those goals, all those plans are God's. And you think things are just going crazy now? Could it be that God's got something in mind? Chapter 45, verse 1. Gotta love it. Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, make everyone go out from me. So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? But his brothers could not answer him. Oh. I mean, they didn't know this was Joseph until just now. And Joseph's going, hey, is my father still alive? And they're going, oh. I got to tell you, sometimes things happen and God just renders us speechless. And it's beautiful because after we get a chance to process it, we look back and go, okay, now I see what God was doing. I look at my life, just my salvation, from the point where I recognized that I needed to be born again when I was in the 8th grade. And I didn't actually surrender my life to Christ until after my senior year in high school, which was a foolish, foolish thing to do. But that's where I was. And when I finally gave my life to Christ, now I've looked back on my life from the 8th grade all the way through my senior year, and I see how God put people in my life all the way through those years. I'm talking person after person after person. And at the time, I never could have known who those people were, what they were doing. I mean, I knew them personally, but I could have never known what God was doing. And then once I was born again, and later I looked back and I realized what God had done. And that's the brothers. They're speechless. And so he says in verse 4, please come near to me. So they came near. Then he said, I am Joseph. Listen to me. I'm your brother who you sold into slavery in Egypt. But now, watch this. What do you think? Joseph had a couple of options. They're thinking he's going to kill us. Or he's going to throw us in jail. I get why they're speechless. We probably deserve it. But he's going to kill us. Verse 5, but now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Joseph had enough perception to realize they were no longer angry with him. They were actually sorry for what they had done. They actually regretted it. I'm not saying they're perfect. We're going to see them do some other bonehead stuff down the road, but I'm telling you here, it seems that they have been changed. Could it be that God said, there's no way all these sons of Israel can work together unless I bring them through 20 years? Joseph rising to power, the brothers dealing with their own guilt, and now I've got them to this point. I want to skip forward as Joseph tells them what's happening about the dreams. Joseph's been weeping. You know, when you're younger, you don't always understand weeping because you're happy. I think as you get older, you understand a little bit more about weeping because of joy, right? Joseph's done that. Skip all the way down to verse 25. Then they went up out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan to Jacob their father. They're so excited. Good news. And they told him, saying, Joseph is still alive. Dad, sit down, because you ain't going to believe this. He is governor over all the land of Egypt. We're not kidding. And Jacob's heart stood still because he did not believe them. But when they told him all the words which Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob their father revived. And Israel said, it is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive, and I'll go to see him before I die. Watch this. After everything that had happened, after everything that had taken place, after all the bad stuff and all the commotion and all the confusion, the last puzzling turn of God's sovereignty in this story is Him birthing joy in their hearts. Folks, let me tell you something. Part of God's sovereignty is He'll work out these plans, and then He'll bring us to a point where He will birth His joy in our hearts. But I'm telling you, if we're not careful, if you won't trust God through the trials, you're going to miss the part where He births joy for you. You've got to walk with Him through the crisis and the events and the designs He's making and the baffling plans to ultimately come to a point where now you can experience the joy that God has for you. What a magnificent story of God's sovereignty. And I got to tell you, I wrestled with this thing saying, Lord, I'm not so sure. I don't need to preach this over 3 weeks. But I feared it would lose its punch if we didn't see all the turns that were taken, all the puzzling turns of God's sovereignty. Listen, God in His sovereign will often works in amazing and puzzling ways. But He always has a plan that glorifies Him and edifies you if you are His child. Some time ago, I came across a picture. I'm going to tell you about it. In a moment, I'm going to show you one up here on the screen, but before I do that, I want to tell you about the picture I found. It's a picture with a completely black background and a vertical dividing line to divide the picture in half. And at the top, on either side, it has the word success. On the left side and the right side, it has the word success. And on the bottom, on the left side, it has the statement, what people think it looks like, with a straight arrow from point A to point B. And on the right, underneath success, it has the phrase, what it really looks like, with a squiggly arrow going all over the place and finally coming out at the end. And I have adopted that except at the top. Put it up there now, Jason, if you will. The left, God's sovereignty, what we think it looks like. On the right, God's sovereignty, what it really looks like. See all the squiggly lines? That's us trusting God through it. And there are a lot of Christians, I fear, who won't trust God through it. And so when we come out on the other side, they're missing the outcome and the joy and the benefit. Folks, don't give up. God is sovereign. Don't lay down. God is sovereign. Don't quit. God is sovereign. Don't run away. God is sovereign. Don't, if you fall down, get back up. God is sovereign. If you stumble, catch your balance, keep walking. God is sovereign. I'm not sure how bad it is in your life right now. I'm not sure how difficult it is. Maybe it's a little, maybe it's a lot. But mark my words, God is sovereign. And He has a plan. And it can be awfully puzzling. But your story's not over yet. You say, Pastor Johnny, it's easy for you to say. With Joseph, I mean, we're looking back on his life now. He came out. We know he came out of it good. Really. Do you think Joseph knew that 10 years in? 5 years in? This thing took 20 or 25 years to come to fruition. You think Joseph, 5 years in, 4 years in, some of you are 1 year into a problem and you're convinced it's all over. Some of you are 5 years into a problem, you're convinced it's done, it can't be helped. I'm telling you, God is sovereign. And He has a puzzling way of working at times, but that's okay because He's sovereign. Could I suggest to you today that today is the first time for you to come and say, Pastor Johnny, for you to walk and experience the benefit of God's sovereignty, could I suggest the first step is knowing God in a relationship through His Son, Jesus Christ. You've got to know that you're born again, know that you have eternal life, know that you're walking in fellowship with God. And then you can begin to experience over time a walk with Him through trials and difficulties and challenges to ultimately come out and see that joy that He offers. But first it begins in a relationship with Christ. And maybe you have that today and maybe you don't. But could I suggest to you today that during this invitation time, it's time for you to come on down. Say, Pastor Johnny, I would like to talk with somebody about how to trust Christ as my Savior. Maybe you're here today and you say, Pastor Johnny, part of God's work in my life is to bring me to Green Acres Baptist Church. There are people who have visited this church. There are people who are coming to this church and they haven't joined yet, but it's time. And part of this, the path of God's sovereignty in your life is being a part of this fellowship. And today's your day to come. Just a moment as we stand, I'm going to invite you to come and say, Pastor Johnny, I want to enter into membership at Green Acres Baptist Church and begin to walk with the Lord here in this fellowship. Maybe it is that today, part of what God's doing in your life, you just need to come pray. There are some things God just spoke to you, and yeah, you can pray when you get home, no doubt. But could I suggest that maybe God's just prompting your heart to come right now? Don't let time pass right now and get before Him and just pray. Say, Lord, I just want you to know I'm not sure what you're doing in my life right now. I'm not sure what's going on. But God, I trust you. I'm going to pray. And you're going to stand. And when you do, I want you to respond. Father, right now in Jesus' name, I'm asking, Lord, that you would work in our hearts so that we would obey you right now. You stand.